Hi everyone, I am Jeff Lawton. I'm going to look at the match from 2 days ago between the world champion Magnus Carlsen and Jan Nepomniatchti of Russia. So just to put it into context, the standings at the time, Magnus is on 11 points from the first 5 rounds and Jan is on 5. So Jan, to stand a chance of going past Caruana on 10, he really needs 2 3-point wins, which means both matches without Armageddon. So in the first game, Magnus had the white pieces and he opened with e4. We had c5, knight f3, d6, and we had a Sicilian defense, cd4, knight d4, knight f6, and now this unusual move, bishop to c4, which Magnus played this move in round 1 against MVL, and MVL played here. But Jan tested out the idea with knight takes e4, queen h5, e6, and now Magnus played, well, this was the highlight of the game, really. Why Magnus played this move, losing a piece. The best move on the computer is bishop b5 check, and he would have prepared that and known the move. But he said in the interview the reason he didn't play it was he just completely blanked and could not recall at all what white was supposed to do. But I mean, the second mystery is why he, played this move, because he must have been aware it just loses a piece after knight e6, bishop e6, queen e7. The bishop can't retreat due to knight g3 check, and then it's a discovered check, and also the knight attacks the queen, and the queen, the queen can't come here because it's simply captured anyway. So it was a real mystery what happened. And after this, he played bishop f7, queen f7, queen e2, and now queen e7, firmly hanging on to the piece by protecting it. And then a few moves later, we had queen f3, and then we had castles for black. And now black is simply a very safe piece for a pawn ahead. And the game ended in this position where the rook is trapped. So black is about to go knight and bishop ahead. So for a few pawns that don't really matter that much. So it was a winning start for Nepo. So we then went on to the second game. Jan leading 1-0. Magnus opened with e4. Jan opened e4. We had knight c6. Nimzovich defense, d5, e5, bishop f5. So again, another interesting opening, which Magnus is well known very impressively to play all these different variations, different opening lines. And then later on, they reached on opposite sides castling. Black's castled on the queen's side and white on the king's side, and this, I'm sure you're aware, always makes for really exciting games, opposite side castling. And this was no exception, as Jan now played b4, and then we had f takes e5, de5, and now Magnus felt compelled to play b5 to stop white's idea of b5 himself. And now he broke open the center with d4. Black has to do something because otherwise white's going to advance with a4. And then later on they reached this position, and Jan played a4. So he played the move a4, which again continues the theme of attacking on the against the black king, which is extremely exposed. So this king is nice and safe here with all its pawns unmoved, but this one's only got one pawn next to it at the moment. And then a few moves later, quite a long way later, they reach this position. So it's black's actually a pawn up, but his king's very exposed, and if white can mobilize his queen, then black would be in danger. Magnus found the best defense with king to d7, and after bc7, instead of course he can't take because of check, winning the exchange, Magnus played rook c8, and he was sort of hanging on really, but his king was very weak. However, we go forward a few more moves up to move 33. The king has now walked safely to e8, and it's almost going, getting somewhere safe. And then we had knight e7, rook c7, and now knight d5. The knight's on a very good square here to defend. A bit later on, the king's now made itself much safer on the f7 square. And then we had h6, h5, and this h5 actually gave Magnus chances to play for a win, and we all know he does. Even if he's been losing the game, he'll try and make the most of every position on the board. And then we had king g1, and the game continued until they reached this position where Carlsen had by now gone 2 pawns ahead, and it was white to play, and Jan played rook f8, trying to target the f5 pawn, and perhaps intending, or definitely intending, a queen check. And this is what Magnus didn't realise how strong. I'm not quite sure what happened, but he said after the game he should have simply gone queen to d4, covering the e3 square, and there's no check for white then. And it's just, like he said, an obvious move to make if you notice that it's good, because the queen is centralised on d4. But instead, he played king g5, and after queen e3, he had to go back to g6, allowing queen e6 with a quick draw. And the reason being that if he'd gone forwards, then it runs into queen check on h3. King g5 is forced, and queen f5 check. King h4 is forced, and then after check, again king g5, f4 check this time. King g6 only move, it runs into queen f5 checkmate. So he had to play king to g6, but then queen e6 check. King h7, again, is unable to come forwards because of rook takes f5 check. And now after g5, there would come rook f6. And I'm showing this because this is what happens if black tries to hang on to the pawn or play on. If black tries to play on, then only rook here prevents the mate, apart from queen d6, which drops the whole rook, of course. But then we just have queen h3 mate, so black has to play king back to h7. But now there came queen g8 with a simple repetition, king g6, queen e6 check, king h7, and a couple more repeats of the position, and the game was drawn. So Jan, after 2 games, now led by 1.5 to half, with 2 games to go. So Magnus is white in this game, and we'll see the surreal chess continue as he opened d4, knight f6, bishop f4. So this is like a London system. c5, we had d5, or it's an early London anyway, d5, d6, and now knight to c3. And then we had a6, a4 to prevent the expansion with b5. And now we had e5, and so black had sort of a check Benoni type structure. We had bishop to d2. Now it was Jan's turn to join in with the sort of surreal nature of the match by playing e4, which is probably a move that most players simply would not consider, I would venture to suggest. And then we had h3, which means that Magnus wants to put the bishop back on this square, and then later on it can come to h2. So the game continued on to this position. I'll just show the next few moves. It was Magnus's move, and he played knight to e2, developing knight g to e2, and then knight e5. And now this knight maneuver, we'll just watch this knight. We need to keep an eye on it, because remember, this is our chess both players were playing. But this is extremely logical, I should add, but it just somehow added to the surreal nature of the openings, even though this is completely good play here by Magnus. Knight b3, bishop g6, and now knight d2, targeting the pawn. So the knight has played one move, 2, 3, 4 to get here, and in a few more moves it headed to c4, and then landed on the nice square b6 to force black's rook to move here, and then black was unable to castle. So later on they reached this position, and Jan played knight to e5, and we had knight b6 with, as I mentioned, forcing the rook to move. And then we had f4, knight back to d7, knight e d7. And now it turns out that the pawn here although it limits the scope of the bishop, it keeps these knights stuck. They've sort of got nowhere to go because the two key squares they'd like to use, or at least the e5 square, is covered, and it makes it hard for black to use the knights here. So the game moved on later to this position on move 25. It was Jan's turn to move, and he's lost castling rights because both rooks have moved, and he played king f8, and Magnus did a very late long castling indeed. He treble O'd on move 26, and then we had rook e8, rook g2, king g8, and now e4. So now white is opening the position up. There's also prospects of rook g1 targeting the weak pawn on g6. And then we had fe4, knight e4, and now as well as this pawn being weak, the queen is also in a position to attack it from here, and also the knights are targeting this weakness. So we had queen e7, and much later on we got to this position. Magnus has managed to capture the g6 pawn, and black is really completely without counterplay. And we had bishop takes d6, queen to d8, and then king to b1, just waiting calmly. And after rook e4, knight d6, queen d6. Looks as if black might have got somewhere. The rook's still passive, of course, but and he's got two pieces for the rook. But after rook e6, there's more difficulties for black because white is hitting the knight twice, and also the queen is hitting b7, and black can't protect both. And it's best to keep the peace. So he played queen f8, queen b7, and then the game went knight g8, queen e4, queen f7, rook e8, rook h6, bishop h6, and queen e6 more or less forced a winning endgame for white, which Magnus soon converted. So he'd got back into the match after 3 games, and we move on to the 4th game. So it's the deciding game, and this time things settled down a bit. We had what you might call a sort of a normal opening. We had e4, c5, knight f3, knight c6, knight c3, e5, which Magnus often plays, bishop c4, bishop e7. We basically got into a interesting line of the Sicilian where black concedes white this one square, but has prevented white from playing the normal break with d4. Instead of that, white tends to play for f4. And a few moves later, we got to this position, and sure enough, we had f4. After ef4, knight f4, white's now the one with a bit of initiative. He's managed to get the f file open. He's got the f5 square as well for a piece now, i.e. a knight, and still got the d5 square. So we move on a few moves, and we get to this position, and we had g3. We had g3. So Magnus clarified the position with bishop f4, gf4, and now f5. And then we had rook a to e1, hoping for this, but then after fe4 we have f5, and after knight e5, de4, white is a really strong attack here. So instead, Magnus played rook f7, because the point here is that white has a absolutely fantastic bishop, and this gives white the advantage, and his pieces they're all very well placed, sort of poised, if you like, to attack the king's side. So Magnus has to defend, and then queen g5 happened, and after d5 takes, black is sort of struggling a little bit now, because after knight d5, queen d5, we had h4, and now there's no stopping the pawn advancing to h5 and then h6, and then the bishop becomes even, even more mighty than it is already, more mighty, stronger than it is now. So we had a few moves later, we had the pawn had got to h5, and Jan played h6, knight to e6, queen g2, and now knight d4, blocking the diagonal. So Magnus has managed to get his knight from where it was. He's manoeuvred it to here and finally to here, which is an excellent defensive maneuver to limit the scope of the bishop. So then we had rook to e5, queen d6, and now the move b4. So it's tempting black to play c takes b4, and then the idea would be after rook e1, the threat is rook to d5. So, for example, if you play rook f8, it simply doesn't help. There's rook d5, and then after queen takes f4, rook d4, queen h6, rook takes b4, it would be white with all the chances. It's only 2 pawns for the piece as well. So instead, Magnus played the much better move, knight to c6. We had rook check on e8, rook takes e8. Sorry, we would have had this. I apologise if cb4. We would have had this line, and after rook f8, queen g7 is indeed checkmate. So Carlsen correctly did not play this, and instead he played queen takes h6. And after bc5, we had knight to c6, and now rook e3. And then we had rook to d8. So black is over the worst, but it's still some advantage to white. We had rook 1 to e1. Again, queen f4 is not possible because after rook check takes, you have to block with the rook, and then queen g7 would be mate. So instead we had rook 8 to d7, and we had rook g3, rook d e7, rook e7, rook e7, and then we had check, king h8, and after a few more moves, the game was a draw. So a really well defended by Magnus, and Jan not quite able to push home his opening advantage. So we then went into, because the score was now 2-all, having Magnus lost the first game as white, Jan won the first one when he was black, and then Magnus equalised the score in the third. We then reached Armageddon game, which is where, interestingly, I think it's correct that Magnus chose to have the white pieces, which I don't think too many players do, because white needs to win. And we'll have a quick look at the opening. He played d4, knight f6, knight f3, and they reached this position. And here, Magnus played d takes c5 from here, which gives a symmetrical pawn structure, but he just played for a slight edge. And I'll just flick through the games, because if you want to watch the whole game, I've done a separate video of this game, looking at the whole game in more detail. And they went to this position where we then had bishop to a6, and we had a few exchanges. Bishop takes a6, queen a6 occurred, and then queen e4 hit the knight, queen b7, knight c4. Then we had further exchanges on d1 and again on d8. The rooks came off, and then the queens came off on b7. So we headed towards an endgame. And then later down the line, we got to this position, and it was Carlsen's move, and he played f4, and after f5, captures on f6, captures on f6. We had f5, and after knight check, he dropped the king back here, sacrificing a pawn to break up the pawns. So we had this endgame, and later on, yet more pawns came off the board as Magnus played knight c6, knight takes a4, and then knight takes a7, check, king here. We had knight d1 hitting the bishop, which captured on b6, and after knight e3 captures back. Then we had king d3. So now we had 3 pawns each. We've got a knight via bishop, usually favours the bishop, but white has sort of got an outside pass pawn. But this is effectively by this stage on move 49, effectively a bullet game, and flagging comes into it. So a few moves later, they reach this position, and at this point, Magnus played knight a5, and Jan marched his king heading towards this square. Yeah, I said I was going to do this in brief, and I'm not able to do it, am I? But anyway, they reached this position, and here Jan played f5, which allowed Magnus to eliminate the pawns. A better move was king f2. When I say eliminate the pawns, I mean eliminate all of the kingside pawns. And after knight takes f5, just doing that more slowly, knight takes f5, king takes g2, knight takes h4, king takes h3. We then had knight f5. So white's got just one pawn left, but with the time shortage, Magnus played on and on and on, and we got to move 71. Played on quite correctly, by the way, because this is part of the rules. It's bullet chess, and it comes with the territory, is using the time situation and flagging. And then a bit later, so this position, it was Magnus's move, and he managed to give the move to black here when the position is winning. In this position, the bishop has to give way, and Jan played bishop to h2. And after knight to e6 check, we had, we basically had resignation by Jan, because if you go here, then knight c7 cuts off the bishop's protection of the queening square. So I presume he resigned or just got flagged and lost on time in a losing position. So Magnus, after that, won on Armageddon, which means you win by 2 points to 1 for Armageddon rather than 3-0. And so the standings after round 6 completion, the other games were finished yesterday. Magnus is equal at the top. The top 4 players are now bound to qualify, but we've got, in fact, looking at the clock here, we've got 7 minutes time. We've got the next round. So even though there's no qualification, there's a lot of prize money at stake. You know, there's quite a large range in prizes for the bottom 4 players, which no doubt will come into their motivation. And also, it'd be very interesting. I'm looking forward to seeing Ding and Magnus play. They're paired together in round 7. So thanks for watching that. It's meant to be a quick recap. I'll have a look in a minute and see how many minutes it took to do. But thanks for watching. I hope you enjoyed it. If you did, please thumbs up and subscribe. That would be wonderful. Thank you for watching. Bye now.